Welcome everyone to the third and final chat in the speaker series for the exhibition History is Really Black or White at the Agnes Everington Art Centre in Kingston, Ontario. My name is Jason Cyrus, the 2021 Isabel Bader Fellow in Conservation and Textile Research. I am the curator of the exhibition, and I am joined today by the fantastic and brilliant and wise Professor Nigel Lezama from Brock University, and Dr. Julie Crooks from the Art Gallery of Ontario. Our conversation today is entitled Stylist Armor, Identity, Clothing, and Self-Fashioning in the exhibition and within our works. But as we talk about clothing and as we talk about identity and race, we almost must talk about land. And it's important to note that the Agnes is situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee territory, in what is now known as Kingston, but has traditionally been known as Cataraqui. I myself am Guyanese Canadian. I come from South American country that has been the traditional land of the Amerindian and the Arawak First Nation. And as an immigrant settler, I have a very complicated relation to the land that is very layered. It's important to me that my work and the work that I'm a part of in this project with the Agnes is part of advancing reconciliation and decolonization and placing the stories and realities of marginalized identities front and forward. I'm so happy that you're all joining us today. We've been blown away by the interest in the exhibition and in these talks. We've had over 400 people sign up overall. We've had folks, I'm just going to look over at my screen here so I can give you a good overview of just where folks have been coming in from. Definitely Ontario. We've got people from all over Canada, from PEI, from Nunavut, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Alberta, BC, and Quebec. And that's just Canada alone. We've had folks tuning in from the US, a large contingent from the US, as well as the UK. Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Brazil, Spain, Israel, and Norway. It's been fantastic to know that the work that we've worked so hard to put together has reached a global audience. And we've had over 2,400 folks access the online website, again, coming from as many varied places. And it's important that a conversation like this is heard and is had. What I'm going to do is just give you an overview of how today is going to go. I will, first of all, introduce your speakers and read their bios, and as well, I will give you an overview of the exhibition. For many of you, we've had the joy of understanding that many of you have signed up for all three sessions and you've been consistently coming. So I don't want to bore many of you with an overview that you've already heard, but I'd like to give some folks who are joining us and you an opportunity to just get a sense of what the show's about, what its core points are, and how it connects to our speakers. And then I will kick it over to Nigel and Julie, who will share a bit of their work, introduce themselves to you, then we'll get into a chat, because that's why we really are all here. To many of us, Dr. Julie Crooks needs no introduction. She is the curator of the arts of Global Africa and the Diaspora at the Art Gallery of Ontario, previously photography curator as well at the AGO. She has done many exhibitions and projects with BAND, Black Artist Network and Dialogue Gallery, as well as the Royal Ontario Museums of Africa project. She holds a PhD from SOAS, the Department of History of Art and Archaeology at the School of Oriental and African Art Studies at the University of London. She is also a dear mentor and friend, and I'm so honored and grateful to have her here today. Professor Dr. Nigel Lezama also needs no introduction. He is an associate professor of modern languages, literatures, and cultures at the Department of Brock University, as well as being the graduate director of French Studies. His work examines marginalization and peripheral fashion and luxury practices and how they transform dominant culture. Lezama also is co-editing, or has co-edited rather, the volume Critical Canadian Luxury Studies, The Centering Luxury, which will be published through Intellect Books. Nigel is also a dear mentor and friend, and I am extremely fortunate to have Nigel and Julie here to chat with us today. Thank you for being here. What I will do now is give you an overview of the exhibition, And again, I'll try not to do that for too long so we can get into our chat and then we will get going. Okay, so history is really black or white, gives you an overarching look at the connections between the cotton supply chain in the 1800s via the antique and historic garments at the Agnes Edmonton Art Center that are in our permanent collection, and the cotton supply chain and its connections to harmful resource extraction, exploitative labor practices in the form of the transatlantic slave trade, and the connections that these factors have to life in Canada and the way that Canadian diversity and identity has been crafted, specifically in relation to Blackness. In this first gallery, you're seeing a setup that pairs the Agnes cotton garments with a map and artwork, again, also from the Agnes's collection, that gives you a sense of that wider supply chain. The artwork in the back shows a sense of the ports, the lands, the plantations, and the central figures that have created this wider supply chain. The exhibition also uses, or rather is in conversation with contemporary art. We've been extremely fortunate to have Karen Jones, multidisciplinary artist from Vancouver, create a special commission for us. This is called Freed. And Karen's installation is primarily made of raw cotton and black hair that she's collected from salons close to her studio in Vancouver. And what Freed does is that it presents, in a sense, a praxis or a methodology for the exhibition itself. It's a veil of cotton and hair that surrounds a gorgeous wedding dress from 1893. And the point of the installation is to show that while we normally, from a fashion historical perspective, look so much at the materiality of this garment and where the materials are coming from and how the material would have come through trade networks, as well as the way that a garment is made and constructed, whether that be embroidery or corsetry or how the fabric is loomed, as well as the garment's social and personal biography, both its wearer and its maker. Freed tells us that we must also look at the humanity and the social and cultural history that is involved in the making of a garment. By encircling the garment with this veil, Freed and Karen's work talks, in a sense, says that we must also look at the humanity involved in making a garment such as this, whose history and whose very makeup comes from the transatlantic slave trade. The exhibition also uses conservation science to tell this story. We partnered with the Queen's Facility for Isotope Research to use a process called isotope analysis, whereby you can learn so much more in detail about this process in our online exhibition created by Danita Shurius, our digital director. What isotope analysis does is it reduces the fiber sample from the garments to its core elements, carbon, lead, strontium, oxygen, and hydrogen. And based on the unique signature or makeup of that, of those elements in each sample that we've selected from the cotton garments of the Agnes, you then can get a sense of where geographically the garments would have come from. This part of the project was spearheaded by the brilliant Anne-Marie Guérin, who is the conservator on this project. And she partnered with QFIR to be able to use this process. I just spoke with Evelyn and Dan from the QFIR lab, and the process, while we wrapped that up, I would say in September, it takes very specialized expertise and takes a while to be able to interpret this raw data. And we're hoping to be able to announce that soon. So please check back into the website and see what else there is to learn. So the first gallery, which is also behind me, like I said, set up this wider cotton supply chain, looking at mixing material culture with social and political history, while also using science as a way of connecting these pillars, so to speak. The next gallery connects us now to the humanity of the cotton trade, specifically in the 1800s. Here we're looking at the history of the Gullah Geechee Nation, an amalgamation of different people groups taken through the transatlantic slave trade and forcibly settled in the southern coast of the United States. And this is an installation created by Damien Joel, interdisciplinary artist who uses fashion, installation, photography, and film as his medium. And what Damien did was create a fashion story that tells the Gullah Geechee nation's past, present, and future. And this was done in conversation with the nation itself. Now we're moving into what I call, in a sense, the Canadian reality. Based on the fact that many descendants through the transatlantic slave trade came into Canada through different migratory routes. One central to the exhibition being the Underground Railroad. In this gallery, we're looking at routes from different American states and plantations that were there, and its connecting points to the ways that folks settled in Upper Canada, also known as Southern Ontario, and created a life here. We've got in the exhibition, as you can see on the left, different tintypes that which we will speak to in our chat, that show the ways that folks who came through the Underground Railroad used clothing and style and photography as this way of leaving their past behind and creating a new identity for themselves and reclaiming their humanity. There are fantastic archival loans from the Queen's Special Book Library, as well as the Ontario Archives, of the very first printed copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin that still contain some errors and some a name change of a character, that rather an original character whose name has since changed, as well as Benjamin Drew's A North Side View of Slavery. So while Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is an allegorical account based on Henry Josiah's life, Benjamin Drew's book, A North Side View of Slavery, is the actual account of folks who have been settled in Southern Ontario. And it shows the atrocities that they went through leaving and also during enslavement. And crucially to this part of the exhibition, the reality of their life in Canada, that Canada was, while it was different to their existence in the States, Canada was not necessarily a complete safe haven. And that's what the artwork of Gordon Shadrach, the portraits that you see behind the clothing there, speaks to, that so many things that are a part of our contemporary Canadian conversation, Black Lives Matter, social justice, racial equality, and many conversations that there has been a resurgence to after the summer of 2020. Gordon's work speaks to and troubles this idea of Canada and identity and race, and Canada being this place where, because in relation to the States, we're seen as a place that's much better, racism does not exist. And Gordon paints contemporary creatives similar to himself in a historic style, and he uses a very subtle and sophisticated way of portraying different identities in different ways, in different clothing, with different clothing choices, to really show how our way of seeing and our way of perceiving identity is linked in so many racially construed points. And in a sense, what I hope the exhibition does is show the historical precedent for that, using the cotton supply chain as an example. We hope that folks can come through the gallery and see themselves represented, can see their stories represented, and this can be a spark for deeper conversation, deeper learning. That's the exhibition in a nutshell. Please, like I said, do come and physically visit digitally as well. There will be some wrap-up events. Can't believe I'm saying that already. Feels like we just began in March. And I will kick it over to Julie, and Julie will show a bit of her trailblazing work after which Nigel will share and we'll chat. Julie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Jason. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation with myself and Nigel, and trying to kind of think about style and fashion and clothing and attire through the perspective of your amazing exhibition, and congratulations again on it. Yeah, I guess I'm going to whiz through this so that we can really open it up to our larger conversation and questions from the audience. So you mentioned the last gallery in your exhibition, which is kind of devoted to the kind of Canadian perspective and Canadian story. And I organized the show even before I was hired at the AGO, called Free Black North, and that was in 2016, I believe. And that was, of course, the year that Canada was celebrating the sesquicentennial. And I kind of had that in the kind of back of my head when I was thinking about this show, and that's why the title, "The Free," is italicized, really questioning this, exactly what you brought up in your opening remarks, this notion of Canada as this refuge of freedom, when in fact, a lot of the descendants of the folks who came through the Underground Railroad experienced a lot of and continuing, anti-Black racism and marginalization. So I wanted to kind of highlight that. It's kind of tongue in cheek, I guess, in the show, but really use the tintypes, these objects, to tell a story of kind of the individuals. We don't know a lot of their names, but the kind of subjects who descended from that history and were living in places like Amherstburg and Chatham and Buxton, but who either find themselves, going to photo studios and getting their photographs taken, or these photographs are kind of handed down. They're circulated. Michigan is right across from Amherstburg, and then through a kind of larger American space of circulation of these objects. So either way, the objects end up in the Alvin McCurdy collection at the Ontario Archives, and I think that for me, I kind of wanted to highlight these histories, and then kind of the happenstance. They're kind of self-fashioning, right, in the tintypes. And of course you pointed that out to me when you first visited the show. And I kind of took a closer look at that. And yes, if these individuals are going to a kind of itinerant photography studio in these areas, they are going to dress up. They are going to present themselves the way in which they want to be seen. So I've always kind of been fascinated at that little moment of realization that it isn't only about the objects themselves, but the way the subjects are presenting themselves. Next slide. And these are other objects, a cabinet card and a tintype again. And I think these objects really showcase the way that Black individuals, Black women, were presenting themselves in studio photography. And the tintype with the women with Niagara Falls as a backdrop is my personal favorite, because it's, it is a backdrop, of course, it's not Niagara Falls, but, it's the kind of quintessential, tourist, idea, that is being presented, that, here we are, we visited Niagara Falls and we want to commemorate that moment. And I would say that the studio image is the same thing, commemorating perhaps a special occasion in this young woman's life, who knows, but I do love this, the way they're kind of presenting themselves. Next slide, please. Then in who knows what year that was, 2019, I think.
2019, I think so, yes.
Yes. No, I think it was 2018. I organized a show on the work of Micheline Thomas, queer African American artist, whose kind of signature work is kind of highlighting Black women. So that's the title, Femme Noire. And of course, doing it in, a way, yes, 2018, great, thank you. Really giving voice and presence and power and representation and of course, a kind of sartorial larger than life again presence for Black women. So these collages, the collage paintings are embedded with crystals and African fabric as a motif. And in this example, a golden afro. So really highlighting, not only trying to kind of empower Black women in representation and rethinking and reclaiming art historical, the art canon actually that put Black women in the shadows or behind the white woman or the servant. Micheline Thomas is thinking about really rethinking that those kinds of associations and reclaiming Black women, Black beauty, whatever that means. And it was really a wonderful kind of intervention in the museum space to do this exhibition. So here again, Micheline, photograph. This is the painting, the photograph for the original painting, La Demoiselle. Nope, it's. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the title.
Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So this was the kind of. Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Thank you. The photograph that was used for the painting, and again presenting Black women riffing on that painting taken in front of MoMA. So there are all of these interventions that Micheline is making in this work. And of course, Fragments of Epic Memory, which is, a completely different exhibition that is exploring a historical archive of photography from the Caribbean, from the 19th century into the 1940s. And I mirrored I combined the historical with the modern and contemporary. So the modern and contemporary are in conversation with the historical. So ending on Ebony Patterson's incredible triptych video called Three Kings Weep. And I think we'll talk about that because I think my time is done.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Julie. That was a phenomenal overview, because what I think is so impactful about your work is the way that you mine historical research and connect it with contemporary art, looking across different medium, whether it be installation, photography, or art itself, and putting front and center these identities, whether it be uncovering them from history in the way that Micheline's work really challenges those narratives, and also showing the multiplicity of identity in the way that I think Fragments has done in such a powerful way. But we'll chat about that very soon. But thank you so much. And of course, as someone who studies style and fashion, the clothing is always front and center. This way of clothing as a way of crafting identity and subverting it and challenging it and creating it is front and central in your work. And we're fortunate to have you. Thank you. Dear Nigel, can you continue, please? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, first of all, Jason, for bringing us together. And as always, your work is impeccable. It's just beautiful. And I've gone through the website for your show and was moved in places and I was made aware of things in other places. It was really quite a wonderful work that you've done as you've been doing since I've had the pleasure to know you. And Julie, it is a pleasure to see you again and to have this chance to talk and to hear about your work. And as I was saying earlier, it's a pity that we couldn't do it in person, but pandémie oblige, we do it how we have to. So I thought I would present some of the work that I have coming out imminently, so in the next few months, which kind of situates sort of my thinking on things. And this is sort of like it's a perspective sort of that I think that I've had for a very long time, but through these analyses that I've been doing, I get to build it out a little more and understand my own practice and see how it ties into a larger, I would say, a larger community of practices. I have a book coming out with a very good friend and colleague, a historian of 19th century British Empire, Jessica Clark, and this book is coming out in April. It's called Canadian Critical Luxury Studies, Decentering Luxury, and I think that's the most important part of this project, is that we want to take what we wanted to do when we came together and thought about, like, you know, this object of study, luxury, and luxury being this representation of power, of privilege, and that's something that was really closed off to many. We wanted to understand the functioning, like the political functioning of luxury. But I think as we gathered other colleagues and friends in the field, in various fields, it's an interdisciplinary book in that sense. I think Jessica and we came to understand that there is a luxury that is outside of the center, and so for me, what was instinctual, an instinctual understanding before, but I think as I read through the different interventions in the book, and we were crafting the introduction and the epilogue, I came to understand that in fact it's the individual who creates luxury, and it isn't luxury that is imposed from a metropole or from a dominant culture or from an elite group. There is a luxury that is created by the individual, and it's a luxury that comes out of an idiosyncratic investment, and that's the word that I use a lot. It's the person who creates the luxury, because luxury will, in fact, enrich that person's life in some way. So my work in this book, my case study in this book is on Eaton's in the 1920s and the Made in Canada campaign. And so I looked at the ways that Eaton's created for its consumers a value that was beyond use and exchange value in their consumption, so that ordinary people could feel like they were buying something special, a luxury item. And so that is really the theme that runs through all of my work. And so when we'll see from some of the other pieces that I have coming out, that I'll always try to look at individuals that are outside of the center, that are operating in the margins, whether it's in the 19th century, and we're talking about La Bohème and the poor artists who are working outside of, on the margins of a society that is becoming more and more bourgeoisie, that is becoming more and more middle class and more industrialized, and with the values that entails, the capitalist values that entails. I think, Jason, we can go on to the next slide. And so my work can be quite eclectic in a sense, because I was trained as a 19th century literary historian. I'm working in critical luxury, but it's always the margins that carry me through these these objects of study, and it's always like my curiosity about the margins. And so Cardi B came onto the scene like in 2016, and she's changed things. And one of the things that she's changed would be the expressive artistic manicure. And so I have a piece that's coming out in a volume that's entitled Dangerous Bodies, New Global Perspectives on Fashion and Transgression. That's coming out later this year. It's edited by Jackie Wilson and Royce Mahawati. We met at a conference in London, at an art historians conference in London, and they'd asked me to participate in their volume. And so I'd been thinking about Cardi B's nails, and what had struck me was that I was, at that time, I was out shopping. I'd be out, you know, and I think it was maybe a Tom Ford beauty counter or something. And then I looked and I was like, all of the girls have these nails, and these nails were like, prior to this, not well regarded, right? And so I wanted to examine, like, well, is this, and at the time I was thinking, you know, through Pierre Bourdieu, and so is this a habitus change of the mainstream society, or is this black style as costume, and what was going on here? And so, and what is the value of a manicure? And so when I started to examine salon culture, and then it spread into mainstream culture, US, when I say that, I say Black American salon culture, I came to understand that the manicure was not just a manicure. So the salon was a space where women could build relationships, it was an opportunity for self-care. And so the manicure itself was not just adornment. There was a value that came outside of that, and that becomes that surplus value that I'm always looking for, that indicates to me that that it is a luxurious experience. And so the study that I did on Cardi's manicure, it started from that perspective, and then I questioned, well, what happens now when this I think specific luxurious experience in Black culture, what happens as it expands out into a wider field? And obviously, I think obviously, I found that something is lost in that, and so that what was signaled to me, and it's another sort of theme that runs through the things I do, is that while there may be an opening up of space for these expressions that come from outside of the mainstream, there's still change that needs to happen in terms of the structures of power. And so that the introduction of like this excessive style that comes out of Black women's experience into the wider culture does not come with a full-on acceptance of this subjectivity, I would say. I think we can move on to the next slide. And I have another article coming out later this year. This one is in a volume that's edited by the fashion scholars Vicky Karaminas, Adam Getchie, and Pamela Church Gibson. And the volume is called Fashionable Masculinities, Queers, Pimp Daddies, and Lumbersexuals. And this is a study that had been on my mind. This is something that had been on my mind for a while, and Jason helped me with this, with the archival research. He gathered a lot of the images that I used in this analysis, and I've chosen this one because again, as I talk about the difference between these luxurious expressions when they happen within I guess an originary culture, and then when they're adopted or adapted by a wider culture, there is for me, there's always something, or at least in the things that I've been studying thus far, it feels to me that there's always been something that's been lost. So Puff Daddy is, I think, a bit of a controversial figure in hip hop, and so his emergence in the 1990s, there's a shift, I think, from and we've read about the problems with this movement from like a gold aesthetic, symbolizing some kind of like hip hop authenticity, to this platinum aesthetic, where that is tied to like neoliberal ideas, to the mogul masculinity, and then which sort of ends with like the idea that Puff Daddy has sold out to mainstream culture at that time, right? And so these are the tensions that are at play sort of in his aesthetic. So I looked, when I thought about Puff Daddy, and I gathered all these images that Jason had collected for me, and I was going through them, it was his shine that like was the most prevalent, the shine of his materials, of his furs, of his leathers, of his skin, of the sequins and the diamonds, the bling, all of that. That was really quite significant to me. And that shine is, in fact, an aspect of Black style. And so when I looked at his videos and I compared it to some of these mainstream images, the shine was prevalent in both, but I think the shine expressed different things. And so that, whereas in a video like, and there's a moment in this case study where I look at Mo Money, Mo Problems, that video, and there's these moments in the video when Puff Daddy is sort of outside of time, Puff Daddy and Mace, and they're floating around in this space. It's a space beyond what seems to me white supremacy, because there's a story, the storyline in it is a storyline of white supremacy, with the white golfer and Puff Daddy playing a figure like what's his name, golfer Tiger Woods, playing off of a figure like Tiger Woods. But then in these outside spaces where the shine is full on, it's bright colored suits covered in plastic overlay, and shiny watches and things. There's this playfulness, and that's also something, there's this pleasure that is really quite integral, I think, to Black style, to Black culture, and to luxury. And then I would say that, and I've been talking a lot, I know, I'll close it off by saying, but then what happens when it goes into the mainstream, into this Vogue feature, for example, is that the shine changes, and there's more of a question of objectification that happens. And so what I had concluded is in that piece is that Puff Daddy becomes a penis in furs. Emphasizing his status as an object of the gaze. And I'll stop there. Thank you for keeping me in line, Jason.
No problem, Nigel. Thank you so much. And I thought probably we could chat more about the Tissot image in relation to
yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Your focus, I think, on decentering notions of luxury, and what you said so articulately, idiosyncratic. What was the other word? Frameworks of
investment.
Investments. Idiosyncratic investments. I think it's so important to this framing of the self, of using clothing and using objects to be able to create that sense of identity in who we are. And we'll chat about that in relation to
yes.
What, in the ways that even with your Cardi image, how, she was using different versions of luxurious objects at a specific time in her life to create an image, and how that perception will shift based on who's using those objects, and how that
exactly,
and that's even connected to the transatlantic slave trade and the cotton exhibition that we're chatting about. Julie, I want to go back to Free Black North, and as you said, the exhibition was really formative in my understanding, I think, of what historical research could do, I think, in terms of how I think we can look at objects from a perspective of not just their place within history, but their place within our present. And as you know, fashion is always my lens. So I walked in there and immediately it was the clothing, it was the way that even that beautiful image of I can bring it up so that we can look at that instead of hearing me blabble. But it was just the way that the folks were in those images, in the way that they chose to portray themselves, their shortness, their confidence, and I was so deeply struck, I think, by the ways in which the exhibition did that. And I'm wondering, and of course, the archives, the McCurdy fronds that you activated in the exhibition, I also looked at for History is Really Black or White. And I'm wondering, what, like 5 years on now, 5 years? About 5 years on now, what were your takeaways from the show? This being your first exhibition at the AGO. I remember the place just being filled with people who look like us, looking at the images, there being this murmur, this chatter, this excited engagement with the object, which is very similar to what I saw in Femme Noir and most recently in Fragments. So as a curator yourself, like, what were your takeaways from just seeing the audience interact with the objects and how you use them?
Yeah, I mean, you do a lot of reflecting, post exhibition, and of course during pandemics, that also allows for a moment to kind of reflect on your practice. And I think I've been doing a lot of that. When I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking that actually there is some connective tissue in terms of like a subliminal interest in attire, style, fashion, textile. One of my earliest shows was a quilt show that I did I mounted at the National Film Board. It wasn't even it wasn't a proper gallery, but I gathered quilts from, Buxton and Nova Scotia, and just telling the story of, how those quilts were used and passed down through generations, and, the kind of legacy of quilt making, of, stitching together, histories. And then when I think about the kinds of shows I've done, front and center, though maybe subliminal, there is this notion of self-presentation through clothing. And so I was thinking about a small show I did that someone reminded me about the other day on Teenie Harris, a photographer, Black photographer that lived in Philadelphia, is shooting kind of the local communities, local Black communities in the 40s. So imagine the fashion, 30s, 40s, 50s, right? Mm-hmm. And it is all about that. It is all about, women in very fly suits and men in their, Stacey Adams and hats, and really, really, again, and he had a studio, going into the studio, getting themselves, photographed, etc. At a time that was, of course, fraught with racial tension in a place like Philadelphia. And then fast forward to Free Black North. So that association, I think, with who the subjects are and how they're trying to present themselves, and using clothing as a kind of weapon. And because I have, I come through photography, I think about photographers like Gordon Parks, but I also think about Frederick Douglass. And I just did a short talk about him at the power plant on Sunday. And, the reason that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century, not Black American, American, because he was so conscious of about how one could use the medium to intervene and disrupt and try to dismantle all of the, awful ways in which Black people had been represented, right? In terrible, terrible ways. And so he literally talks about using the medium as a weapon. And so when I go back to the objects in Free Black North, and I think about that, the engagement of the audience with these objects, I think there was a lot of wonder, wonder at who these subjects were, their histories, the kind of hidden history of photography and, Black subjects in photography. And so I think that really percolated in a way. It was a tiny show, as you know, but I think it had quite a big impact because of all of these elements. And that at the time, and when you're curating, you don't realize how many different tentacles, that you've kind of thrown out there, and what's going to stick actually, and the depth of the objects and their resonance, I guess, with a larger audience. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think why the notion of clothing and style so often comes up in your work, and at least for me anyways, is that especially for marginalized identities, clothing is not a benign thing that's interacted with. It always has an extra layer that's attached to one's intersectional identity. Whether it's armor as exploration, as this way of encouraging oneself. So to look at Blackness, to look at the ways that different people go through the world, clothing and style always comes into that, because it's just a way of using it as a tool. Nigel, in terms of this, I'm just looking at these images and I'm struck again by your phrase, you're gonna have to remind me. Yeah, idiosyncratic innovation?
Investment.
Thank you.
Investment.
Investment. And I'm so struck by that thought in these images, because you just think of the history of these folks and
Absolutely.
what their realities would have been like before landing in Canada, and the investment in themselves in this clothing. The fact
Absolutely.
that their own clothing, it's too perfectly tailored to their bodies and fits in terms of the corsetry and the shoulders, and
yes,
and they inhabit the clothes in too a natural way for it to be something that's just in the photographer's studio that they're wearing. And I wonder if you just speak to a little bit about this idiosyncratic investment, in the way that, in a sense, do you see, kind of perceive that in these images a bit? In the sense,
absolutely.
Because this
Absolutely.
to me is a sense of luxury right before.
Yeah. Totally. I think for a couple of reasons, right? I think one of them is the material reasons. I think these are fine materials. I think there are furs, there are pleats, there are pleated fabrics, and these are fine materials, right? And in that sense, yes, these are, I think, bona fide luxuries. We can call them that. But like, to go back to something that Julie had said, like when she was talking about Frederick Douglass, and that I think photography was a weapon that he could use. I think style, in that sense, is like the bullet that you know, right? And so the style that, so these clothes, they can be standard, right? I mean, so these are clothes that would have been worn by other men and women at the time, but they mean something different. And what you're getting at, Jason, I think it means something different on a Black body. So
yes.
the photo, one of the photos that we saw was the man standing in the white trousers and the jacket and waistcoat.
Right. Yes.
And yes, there it is. And like, I thought of that, and like, I mean, white is such a, it brought me back to part of my argument about Puff Daddy and that white fur. White is the most delicate of colors, in that sense, right? That is the color of idle living, right? It's not and Black bodies were not idle bodies, were not perceived as idle bodies. That changes the meaning of white trousers on this body, you know, and that's that idiosyncratic investment. And so for me, there's something subversive. There was a choice, you know, and even if the choice isn't there, the investment happens in the use of that. Like if that was what he happened to have, that is what he happened to have in the studio, to put it on is to feel a certain way, is to be different, right? And so luxury, one of the other sort of undercurrents of my thinking is that luxury always has to be subversive in some sense. Luxury does not answer to ideology. And so these outfits on these people, to me, are subversive, even if they are the fashions of the day, of the time, on these bodies. There is a message of subversion in there somewhere.
Absolutely, yeah. Speaking of, yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up because it's such a brilliant thought. I think we can talk about this forever, actually, or at least for a longer time that we have allotted. Because in my research for the Quick Talk I did on Sunday, I came across a South Carolina slave code that is related to dress. So this idea of subversion is fascinating because basically under the code, slaves were not allowed to wear fine clothes. So, you would wear the roughest kind of so-called Negro cloth, whatever that is. So the fact that you then contest that, as you said, Nigel, by dressing yourself in the finest is exactly that kind of, thoughtful, intentional dressing, which I find really, really fascinating. I mean, it's something that I wish I could write about more, but yeah, I think that it is what, and who knows where the clothing is actually coming from. I mean, in some West African studios, the clothing might be supplied by the photographer, but it is that kind of intentional act that I think disrupts the power dynamic. Right?
Yes,
absolutely.
Exactly.
And in our last session, we chatted quite a bit about the whole notion of where the clothing could come from. And from a fashion historical perspective, we can think of folks like Elizabeth Keckley, Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, who used her own dressmaking skills to buy herself out of enslavement, as well as to therefore then create a business that she had wealthy clientele. But in terms of just looking at, the way that the folks are presented and how they're in the clothing, and how, in a sense, many of these garments predate our notion of ready-to-wear pieces, where you can just pick something that's, rolled a rack. And even, like you're saying, in West African clothing, how that it's cut completely differently to the body. Its relationship to shape is completely different. So the fact that you can't necessarily do that with tailoring, especially in the late 1800s. So and how this brings up a whole number of questions as to, well, where did these skill sets come from? Were they passed down? Were they taught within communities? Was there a quote unquote local market, like a local Black economy that supported the use of these skills in trade? But so much of this that we don't know that I think is important to find out, and I think to research more.
Absolutely.
Jump on that point you just made about the Negro cloth and how the use of this clothing then is this investment, this subversion. And Nigel, again, critically speaking to this notion of luxury, because this brings us to Damien Joel's installation in the gallery, where what Damien has done so brilliantly is use the trappings of luxury, as we know from a fashion business perspective, editorial styling, beautiful fabrics, using cinematographic ways of portraying the collection in this beautifully shot film with gorgeous vistas, and that even he's presented these, but he doesn't call them, it's not a collection, it's a story, because it's telling a wider narrative. And these are not actually garments that are available for commercial sale in a store. They can be ordered almost like a couture garment. They can be made to order. But Damien really wants to share a wider social narrative here. And what's to me is, I think, so telling about both of your comments recently is that, you know, Damien is now using these trappings that we're chatting about, like this, the ways that the garment and how they fit, and, you know, whether they're pleated and the specific things he's using, but he is going against the grain. These are dead stock fabrics. They're all made himself. And he's speaking to, you know, the way that Julie's, you're saying with the Negro cloth, how the Gullah Geechee had to use what they were given, thrust them. You know, the first thing that happens to you when you're off a slave ship is that, you know, every marker of your identity is ripped apart, and you're now just a cog, a number in a larger supply chain. And how then they then still asserted their identity. They still, in the little things, again, Nigel, coming back to your comment about this, like, idiosyncratic investment, they still found a way to create that personal luxury in themselves. And I bring up Damien's garments because I'm wondering if we could just chat to how, in a way, from my perspective anyways, the garments speak so strongly to those topics. Nigel, perhaps you can kick us off.
Yeah, you know, when I was on the website for your show, and then I saw the video and I listened to the interview with the designer Damien, there was something that he said that struck me. And he said, when he was talking about putting together the fashion film, and he said that I don't call them models. So the people that he used, I don't call them models.
Yes.
They are
his muses,
they are
his
living,
tribe. Yes.
Yeah, tribe, but they were like living recipients of an archive. Because what he said, something along those lines, anyways. But they were something about being archives. They weren't models, because models would take away agency. Models, that term, right? And liken that to industry, right? And so he wanted that to differentiate from that. And again, it's that same, that the body in these outfits is what's making the meaning, or drawing out the meaning, right? And so materially, I think, you know, as you said, we're very much in a luxury production, in a traditional or conventional luxury production, in terms of the bespoke, they're ordered, made to measure. But what's more with these garments and with this practice is that the wearer is made central to it. And it's the wearer who creates meaning through experience, right? I think he said in the video, right, that, you know, there was the attachment to land through, you know, these people were barefooted and feeling the land under them, feeling the air and the water. So there's it's the lived experience of it that becomes luxurious, more than even, I think, the material aspects of the making of the garments.
And for me, so much of luxury and fashion is this Western Eurocentric way of looking elsewhere for inspiration, and then bringing it back, and then creating this idea of what is construed as a luxurious garment or a luxurious object. And to me, what Damien is doing here too is placing that front and center, but in direct collaboration with the Gullah Geechee Nation.
Yes.
And, you know, you're not just looking at beautifully made pieces, you're also looking at their history, their past, and their present. On the far left, you've got rice, you've got indigo in the middle, and then you've got cotton. Three central crops that are so important to Gullah Geechee life, past and present. And, you know, with this Mokojambi outfit on the left, it's connections to Yoruban spirituality, with Jordan River in the middle, this whole notion of crossing the Jordan, whether that be the Jordan River being referred to as the Atlantic, and their journey over. But of course, the Jordan River, the way that it was referred to in the Underground Railroad as this, way of getting into freedom, Canada being that place. And it's a little hard to see in this slide, but in Green Sally Up on the far right, Damon has left the back open and exposed to speak to the backbreaking labor that was involved picking cotton. And with Jordan River to the middle, how like the Gullah Geechee now are fighting for land rights as well as to take care of the eroding coastline of the southern United States. And yet, as you're saying about dissenting luxury, we can speak about all these things and still have it be a garment that is quote unquote luxurious. Like luxury and social impact and historical connection are not diametrically opposed, and this whole notion of luxury being the identity itself. And Julie, I see that so much too in Micheline's exhibition, to be honest, in the way that naturally talking about shine, my word, like so much of her pieces are glistening and glittery and embossed, and how much so that she's really troubling this sense of agency and also luxury in that as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that is even as she grows as an artist, I see her associations with Gucci and Dior and making specific work for those high fashion houses, and how while she's doing that, she is a big black woman, a big black queer woman.
Big black queer woman, yeah.
You know what I mean? Who is inserting herself within that industry, within that particular fashion house. And I see it always as a disruption. And I think that her large scale paintings with the rhinestones, I mean, she's been doing that for a while, even before it was kind of fashionable. She was asserting Black women and beauty and definitely luxury. And I think it's so complicated. On the one hand, I think people sometimes think of it as a kind of assimilation politics. That one wants to kind of ascribe to owning an Hermes bag or being on the cover of Vogue or whatever. But I think that it's as Nigel is doing in his work, and yours as well, Jason, it's to trouble that, to be able to kind of dig a little bit deeper and be critical about the ways in which we are thinking about all of it: style, luxury, self-possession. Because I think it's where one is coming from. I was, for some reason, yesterday listening to a lot of Jay-Z. It was like a compilation of Jay-Z. And if you listen really closely to Jay-Z, it is all about, I grew up in Marcy Projects, and now I'm driving a, Lamborghini, and in the middle I was, it's like a social history of, that movement, but really about style and about, and definitely about uber luxury. So I think that's exactly what Micheline and others have been are doing in their work, but particularly Micheline. It's definitely a statement. And Ebony.
I think this I'm just going to bring us back to this for 1 second. This notion of the trajectory and, this understanding where we're coming from is so central to the exhibition's narrative and to what we're chatting about, because there would, this, as we've just previously said, this use of style as a tool specifically to Black and marginalized people, is in conversation with or is in opposition to, rather, the notion of Blackness as inhumane, as an economic cog within the transatlantic slave trade, as something to be policed and controlled. And this is the reason why we focused on the 1800s for the exhibition is that historically it's a time where you really see, yes, slavery was happening just before late 1700s, but into the 1800s is when it's not only the largest number of enslaved Africans or Africans who are enslaved moved across the ocean through empire, but it's when you really see this collusion of the slave trade, commerce, and this global economic system that then makes this way of seeing Blackness systemic, because it now joins this capitalist interest that connects with industrialization. You're seeing the mills in the UK then having to change and adapt to be able to process the raw bales of cotton that are coming in. You're seeing folks leaving the rural areas and working in factories to be able to process the cotton, child labor, the use of coal that's being taken from the environment in harmful ways so that it can power these factories. And then you see where wealth is then being concentrated. And meanwhile, this is creating obviously huge political change, both in Canada and in the American South. You're looking at the American Civil War and so forth, and cotton is a huge part of these things. And so many ways of seeing never change over time. In fact, they've just become more entrenched. So therefore, then that's what then connects us to the use of these tintypes the use of clothing and photography in a way of challenging what has come before. McLean's own work of challenging, when she's reaching back further into our history, but as well of challenging what Blackness is. And Nigel, as you so brilliantly said in your work, in terms of how then we can still in the contemporary moment, how you mentioned like this whole notion of, yes, people would, how when you're the Tom Ford counter and the use of the nails and how in a sense there are these trappings of Blackness and from Latinx communities, but yet so it's taken away from its core and the way that it was used then, and how so often people want in a sense the trappings of the swagger, as we say, the style, but they don't want what comes actually with the Black identity. And I'll move us on quickly to the last question, which is to me what and I'll let you both speak. It just, to me, this is what Gordon Shadrach's portraits in the exhibition so brilliantly do. If you look at the painting on the far left over here, and you look at the painting on the far right, it's the same person that Gordon is portraying, Elixir Elliott, who is a well-known Toronto artist who also works in graffiti as well as painting in different ways. And he's portrayed him in the clothing of his métier, and he's got his mask, he's got more urban clothing. And then in the other one, you're seeing him dressed, in a more historic style that is quite similar to what you were seeing in the tintypes, or as you mentioned, Frederick Douglass, how he would be portrayed. And what I love about this juxtaposition is that you're looking at the ways that how he's portrayed might affect the way that we perceive the same person. Gordon has taken he's taken some liberties with Elixir's skin and his hair and how he's portrayed him, but in the ways that all Black men know that depending on how you portray yourself, how that will also affect how you're perceived and relations to safety. So what I love about both your works, and Julie, this is where you come in, how your exhibitions have, specifically here, I'm using one of the archival images from the Montgomery collection in fragments, as well as We Three Kings installation that made me cry the first time I saw it, and I've seen it now 4 times in fragments. The way that you challenge this notion of what is a hegemonic way of looking at Blackness, of like this idea that the Caribbean diaspora looks like this, or Blackness looks like this. And Nigel, too, just hear how you are, juxtaposing. I'll let you speak to the Tissot painting, but in a sense, I just love the juxtaposition of these images. You've got Annie Leibovitz, who is the photographer of these luxurious sittings for Vogue, and you think of the fact that Puffy and Kate Moss are in Paris for the couture shows, and they're wearing luxurious clothing, and this is a highly constructed shot. And then you've got the Tissot painting that could not symbolize more similar things of masculinity and the patriarchy and clothing and what clothing meant to that epoch in its relation to modernity and change. So Nigel, perhaps you can kick this last part off, just in terms of maybe just chatting about the juxtaposition of these images and how it ties into the sense of looking at the centering these notions.
You know, it's only as you said it that I was like, oh, you know, like there is like a real construction in both of these images, a construction of power that happens in body deportment, in the materials used to express elegance and power and place in society. I had used this image because there's another project, the Tissot image that I've been invited on, tying together art and fashion, and it's really at its like rudimentary stages, and it speaks a lot to the work that your exhibition is doing. And what I'm questioning, want to question is Paris, capital of fashion in the 19th century, by looking at, well, what made it a capital of fashion? Where are these materials coming from? Who is making these materials? And this image has always struck me. It's something that I've always wanted to work on. So I put it in there because it's going to force me to have to think about it. And I'm thinking about the wood, and I'm wondering, is that wood native to France, or is it coming from Central America or from the Caribbean? Like the top hats we know, have, I think, a long colonial history. But by this point, this is like 1865. I think they'd already like decimated beaver populations. So we've moved on to silk, right?
Which has connections to Canada, of course.
Exactly, right? And so it's those kind of stories that I'm looking to tell through art. But as you said, it's really quite striking the differences and the similarities in these two, and I don't know what the link is, whether it is in deportment, in the presentation of the body, or it's in the comfort of wearing exceptional clothing, but there is something that is similar, nevertheless, in these two that merits, I think, like a deeper dive.
Because I mean, we of course Baudelaire and his push for artists to get out there and to observe these subtle shifts in fashion and what that meant to someone's station in life and what that meant to what was the cultural change, and that here are obviously quite wealthy men styled and presented in ways that represent respectability and their station in life. And we can think of the spaces of how this is gendered, like what is considered a gendered space of femininity, what is considered a space of masculinity. They used to do that, and Tissot's then portrayal of this, in a sense, to immortalize this for time. And then Sean over here and Kate Moss and the clothing and the couture, and as you were saying, what he was using to kind of create this image. And Julius, you're saying with Jay-Z, how as you listen to his music, how he's giving you this trajectory of his life, and how it's these markers of luxury that are a point of showing that progression, so to speak, like that, not just like to have things, but to show the come up, as we say, the way of transcending and liberating oneself from an identity that was quite restricted by systemic oppression.
There's something though that as we compare these, and then it makes me think of We Three Kings, that in the Tissot image, I don't know that we have. I think we have like the juste mesure of things. So things are just right in that image, right? And so those, like, it is not a portrait I think from our sensitive eyes, it's a portrait of excess, but I don't know that they, the sitters, view themselves as excessive. I'm not sure yet if they see themselves as excessive in the same way that Puff Daddy is presenting an aesthetic of excess, and that the way that We Three Kings is again an aesthetic of excess. It's pushing beyond what,
and it's just stripping of that excess, actually, because by the end of the video, they start the video, Julie, if not mistaken, they start the video, and then it's in reverse.
It's Three Kings Weep is the title.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they start semi-dressed, right? And then they're dressing themselves. So they're actually armoring, protecting, putting on. By the end of the video, they've kind of crowned themselves either with sunglasses, a bandana, or a hat. And I've always kind of seen this triptych, it's an altarpiece, really, with the fact that this is about extracted labor. If I think about your exhibition, Jason, the production of cotton, which produced into glamorous, excessive clothing that they are putting on to armor themselves, to protect themselves. And the fact that they add the bling, all of the jewelry, the earrings, the kind of slave cuff even, are all connected to the to extraction, the slave trade, labor. And so I see it less, a lot of people look at it and say, oh, it's about bling and it's about, popular culture. No, and the fact that they are weeping. They are weeping because they are tied to those histories. And I think that's why it's really important for Ebony that this work is presented in a place of reverence, so that you are forced to sit in a darkened space and contemplate and reflect on these histories, on the wounds that they are covering up, on the the
clothing
pain.
as that armor, right?
Yeah,
They
exactly.
literally are removing that armor and then putting it back on in reverse.
Yeah.
Because it's those histories, that pain that is tied to this, everything that we're chatting about today, that clothing enables, it subverts it, but also sometimes it can also be a trap, it can also be like this, because there's this idea of what we should look like, right?
Yeah, I think it's a performance, performance of agency, subjectivity. What are they called? The sapeurs in, is it Congo? Men who, dress up. I mean, they have little means, but they hyper dress. This is the kind of epitome of they throw everything into it. The haute couture,
yes. They're like hyper dandies. Yes.
Dapper, bespoke. I think that's what it is. It's a performance of their identities, of aspiration, of the things they see in magazines that they may not have access to, but then they create it. I think that's the height of creativity and a kind of longing and I've forgotten the phrase too. Idiosyncratic
investment.
Right?
Yes. Yes. If there's ever a hashtag for a thing,
yes.
yes. Trademark that. Yeah, that's copyrighted. Yes. Oh, we could chat for much longer.
This is wonderful.
I want to respect our time. We've got 5 minutes. I see 2 questions in the box, so I'm just going to refer to them quickly and I'll wrap us up. Michelle would like to know, Nigel, will your book be available for purchase in Canada?
Yes. It's on Amazon.ca. It will be on Amazon.ca, or it is on there, I think, for pre-sale. And it is coming out from Intellect, but I think it will be also available internationally. You can buy it.
Okay, fantastic. Fantastic. Looking very much forward to that, both for my own studies as well as just in general. Corey would like to know, although I think we've touched on this question in terms of answering it, but Corey mentions that we've all touched on this topic, but they're hoping that we might say some more about strategies that Black artists use to create clothes and luxury in the context of dominant white culture and anti-Black racism. And I believe what we're chatting about in terms of McLean's use of shine and the subversion of that, and with Ebony's work and Gordon, and as well as Damien, in the way that clothing and aesthetics becomes this way of pushing against this hegemonic ideal. But perhaps you can both maybe put in 2 cents in that regard.
Do you want to start, Julie?
I think we've more or less covered a lot of the ground. I'm not sure I have anything else to add.
Yeah.
Nigel?
Yeah, I would like to add, like, in terms of like excess, and like, it's, as we were looking, because I haven't seen that trip, and so it's at the AGO. I'm coming to see it. Like,
Yeah.
Closing soon. Let's see it.
Okay.
So, Julie, is it this weekend?
February 21st.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So I will be there. I need to see it. But this aesthetic of excess, right? And I think one of the other things that I try to explore with excess is that it isn't necessarily a mode of appropriation, or there is a change of meaning that happens with excess. And excess, like, you know, if you think about the lowlifes in the 80s, though, that hip hop, or that they were a gang that would go in and would boost in the store. They'd take all the polo off the racks and pile them all, one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, right? And so in this aesthetic of excess, you're also pushing back against the meaning of luxury, against like this. It doesn't mean what you're telling me it means. Like, look, because I'm putting on 4, 5, 6 layers of something, and it's not changing my status in society. I'm still looked at in the same way. So it's what I think that kind of aesthetic, that aesthetic strategy does is it undermines the hegemonic meanings that are attached to these objects that we call luxury.
Brilliantly said. And of course, as is topical, nobody for me more embodies that recently than our dearly departed Andre Leon Talley. In the ways that, I mean, he, in his very identity, in the way he moved through the world, used excess as this way of creating for himself a space that was uniquely his and inspired so many like myself and us. And, you know,
and as a way of
having that spirit,
himself.
we should dedicate this chat to him and his memory. I cannot thank you both enough for this chat. One of the joys of putting this series together is that I get to speak with people I admire and love, and whose work I am so impacted by. And I am very, very grateful that we've been able to chat together. So this recording will be available online for folks to revisit. And please check back in with the Agnes. We will have some in-person events, hopefully, knock wood, in March. To close the show, please follow Nigel's book that will be out in spring, and make your way if you're in Toronto or in Ontario rather, to the AGO before February 20th? 21st, to see Fragments. Thank you so much, and this will be our last chat of the speaker series, and it's been a complete joy to host you and to share our work with you. Have a good evening.